Okay, our final roundtable is a remarkable group of people, and I'm so grateful you all said yes from hinder and far. Mira Debs, as I've said before, is the director of education studies here at Yale. She teaches courses in the foundations of education, a capstone colloquium in education, and she runs this kind of network of faculty and students involved in this enterprise of education. Not easy to do at a place like Yale, because most people at Yale don't even know we actually do things for teachers or potential teachers, but Mira has seen to it that we do know. She went to the University of Chicago. She was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, did a PhD in sociology at Yale. Her field is essentially urban education. She's done a book called Diverse Parents, Desirable Schools, Public Montessori in an Era of School Choice. She serves on the board of the local Montessori schools and many other things in this community. And Mira was key in our organization of this conference, in suggesting lots of people, teachers, ideas, and we couldn't have done this without her. Dana Goldstein, at the end, is a New York Times journalist, columnist, author of the book entitled The Teacher Wars, which was a bestseller on the history of American public education. She's written also for all sorts of other journals like The Atlantic, etc. She lives in Brooklyn. She went to Brown University, and she was a history major and studied European intellectual and cultural history. I mean, I love that. Has lived in Paris, elsewhere, and she's especially made a career of covering education. And I wrote to her after reading one of her columns on education. I said, got to get Dana Goldstein, and she answered. So you never know. You got to ask people. You know, I once wrote to my hero, Al Kaline of the Detroit Tigers. He never wrote back. Kimberly Robinson is one of the nation's leading experts on education law, especially about K-12 education, Title IX education. She's the editor of the volume, A Federal Right to Education, A Federal Right to Education. That's under some duress right now. Fundamental Questions of Our Democracy is its subtitle. She helped create with Charles Ogletree at Harvard, the Harvard Law School, the project and then book called The Enduring Legacy of Rodriguez, which is about the 1972 Supreme Court case of San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, which is about the potential constitutional right to an education. It lost in that case. She's also written the report entitled Education as a Civil Right, Remedying Race Discrimination and Ensuring High Quality Education. She's a professor of law at the University of Virginia, among other important matters. Daryl Scott used to teach for years at Howard University. He, I think the word is retired from Howard, but then moved to Morgan State University, or maybe, just maybe, he carries on the great legacy of Benjamin Quarles. He teaches, of course, in HBCUs. He had his PhD from Stanford, his BA from Marquette in Milwaukee. He's written all sorts of essays and been involved in collections and books around the history of education and race. He's currently working on two projects, one called How the 13th Amendment Has Nothing to Do with Mass Incarceration. I love the title, Daryl, because I frankly I got angry at that film 13th and all the publicity it got because it never touched on, well, I'll let you handle it. It never touched on how much the 13th Amendment was used in the 1990s to fight human trafficking. And hundreds of people were put in jail by using the 13th Amendment. I just thought I'd throw that in. That's my editorial, not Daryl's. He's also working on a piece called The Lost, Now Found, sorry. Batteries, okay. Don't leave home without them. Sorry, The Lost, Now Found History of White Nationalism in America. There are many other essays, I only name a couple. Post-War Pluralism, Brown v. Board, and the Origins of Multicultural Education. Contempt and Pity is his book, subtitled Social Science, Social Policy, and the Image of the Damaged Black Psyche. And last but not least, my friend, sometime collaborator, Kim Crenshaw. Kim, as you must all know, is the, or certainly one, of the founders of critical race theory, and has for the past 2 to 3 years been taking most of the flack as the living member of the founders of critical race theory. She did a BA at Cornell, a JD at Harvard, an LLM at University of Wisconsin. She's distinguished professor of law at UCLA, and at UCLA she also runs the African American Policy Forum, which undoubtedly many of you have seen the programs that come out of that institute. They're terrific. I was on 2 or 3 of them that Kim got me to do, which is probably one of the reasons she's here. During COVID, we did some amazing panels, and Kim has a team there that really knows how to organize a webinar and get everybody on it to kind of hit their message and get it done in 10 minutes. So she's the editor of Words That Wound, Critical Race Theory, Assaultive Speech, and the First Amendment, among other works. She's also the person who put intersectionality in our language. I've been on numerous panels before. She takes a lot of flack for the things she did invent, and too often for some things she never invented. But one of the most important voices in our business and in this field is Kim Crenshaw. Now, and at first Kim just said, yeah, but I might have to be on Zoom. We said, fine. And then there was the story, but I might be in Rome. I said, well, they have Zoom in Italy. And then a while ago, she said, I'm coming. So here we are. How about we just come in? I can't figure out a logical order for this. Dana, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Or no? All right. Mira is begging to be quick. You know whether to believe that, though, don't you?
All right, you can.
Okay, Mira.
All right.
I got to get my little pad.
I want to thank David for taking the leadership of organizing this incredible conference, and Michelle and all of the Gilder Lehman staff. It has been, I was telling my parents this morning, this is one of the best conferences I've ever been to. So this has really just been such a wonderful conversation across different disciplines, and having teachers and scholars together being in conversation. I wanted to share with my remarks just thinking and synthesizing about some of the experiences and comments that people have talked about over the last couple days. And I think one of the themes that's really so striking from this morning is the close intertwining of public schools and national history. So the project of telling history is very, very much part of the project of public schooling. And that this project is not unique to the United States. This has been critical around the world for creating citizens. And I'm thinking about what Gloria Ladson-Billings said yesterday about public schools also being about the creation of the public good, And one of the challenges that we're facing right now in a lot of the privatization efforts is that, she said, the public good is not the aggregation of a bunch of different private goods together. So part of being in public school involves not always getting what you want, and not always having yourself, not always being centered all the time and needing to listen to other voices. I teach a course in the spring called Comparative International Education, and a lot of that course has been influenced both by my experience being a teacher in the United States, but also the fact that I was over at Oxford for 3 years. And in my third year, since I had funding, I figured this was a good time to get teacher certification, because otherwise I'd have to come back to the United States and pay for it. So I did my teacher training in history at Oxford University and worked in British state schools in these small villages around Oxford. And it was very, very fascinating to witness the telling of national history that was not my own national history. And one of the things that it made me realize is, as much as we're in states of combat in the United States, we have really come a very long way in terms of what is included in the history curriculum. So when I was teaching in the UK, or when I was doing student teaching in the UK in the early 2000s, there had been a big curricular reform effort, part of which was teaching skills from our skills conversation, and really wanting children to think like historians. And there had been a little bit of multicultural education. And so there were several curricular options at various points during the curriculum to bring in some kind of non-white history. But the two most popular options for those world history options, one was Black people of the Americas, and the other option was Native Americans of the Americas. So basically it was like how Americans have been racist towards non-white people. And then the rest of the curriculum was like history of kings and queens in England. And then once you got to year 9, it was like 20th century, World War II, World War I, World War II, and then if you continued in history beyond that, it was just more World War I, World War II, the dictators, how amazing we were on the home front, all that kind of stuff. So basically you would spend about 5 years of secondary school in history learning about World War I and World War II. And what was completely absent from that was any discussion of the history of colonialism. So, and Deja and I were just talking about this recently, because she was studying in the UK and working with educators there, and it does not sound like there has been a significant update of the curriculum, and I wouldn't expect there to be under the Conservative government. But I think especially in the UK today, as you're looking at things like Brexit, as you're looking at the space for immigrants in the UK, there is a huge peril to not knowing this history, because you don't know how colonialism has had an impact on the present day. You don't know and understand why certain populations of people are in the country because of their contribution to the country. And I think that's a reminder to us, looking internationally, as Layla was saying earlier, of thinking about what the stakes are in the telling of this national history. So I'm going to turn things over to my esteemed panelists. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, let's resume whatever order we were planning. That's all. Way too good. Set a standard.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. As a journalist, it's very humbling to be in this company. So thank you very, very much for having me here today. I thought I would just talk a little bit about how, as a reporter, I have approached the subjects that you all have discussed over the past couple of days. I began a series of articles on the American social studies curriculum back in late 2018. So that was not that long ago, but it was a long time ago in the history of what we're talking about, because it was before the publication of the 1619 Project, before the pandemic, before the George Floyd protests, and before the sort of national debate about critical race theory. That's a lifetime ago in journalism years. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've learned along the way. It is notoriously difficult, as you all know, to get a grasp on what is taught in American classrooms in any subject, let alone one like history or social studies that's not quite as mandated from the state level. And that's because of what the historian David Laborie has called the radical decentralization of our school system in the United States. So unlike in the UK, as Mira was saying, as you all know, I don't have to tell you, we don't have a national curriculum, and the state standards that we have are kind of loosely enforced. So I thought to myself, how will I get a picture, as my editors wanted me to do, of what is actually taught? And so I decided I was going to start with looking at the directions that teachers get. And as you all know, those are state standards. So the first piece I did was on the deeply politicized process of rewriting Michigan social studies standards. And this took place in 2018 and 2019, so during the Trump years. A group of highly engaged Christian right state legislators, judges, and community activists had gained significant sway over this process. The way they did that is essentially by just writing to the State Department of Education to complain about the current standards. They were then just invited to participate in a panel rewriting the standards. That's it. This wasn't sort of like high level activism. A couple of people in this group should, I'll speak frankly, probably never should have been invited to be part of this process. They were very active on social media, spreading conspiracy theories of different kinds. Now, this was before the current age of conspiracy that we're in, but for example, linking vaccines to autism was a big issue for one of these folks. So not potentially the folks you want in the room. Nevertheless, they did end up in the room. That provoked a backlash. And I eventually got the chance to sit in the room with this broad group of people that had come together in Michigan to rewrite those state social studies standards. And it included historians, it included educators, and included these right-wing activists. And it was really interesting to be a fly on the wall. I learned that in many states, there's basic elements of the history of race in America, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and redlining, that remain just completely missing from state standards for history. They're not spoken of at all. And I did get to be part of discussions or watch discussions on something like, for example, should the World War II curriculum mention Japanese internment? And if so, how big of an emphasis should it be? And it may seem insane that that was a debate in 2019, but it was. And the motivation of the conservatives, who were really fearful of too much of an emphasis, as they would put it, on Japanese internment, was simply that the story of World War II, the way we traditionally tell the story, is a point of great pride in our nation's achievements, a time when we were the defenders of liberal democracy, a time when Black and white in America were able to come together to fight for democracy abroad. And there was just a very deep concern on the part of conservatives that this moment of pride would be degraded with a greater emphasis on Japanese internment. And so I think this is something that I will continue to mention, because this idea of patriotism being a purpose of the social studies or history curriculum is a very deeply held belief. I think it needs to be grappled with on its own terms. And I think the way that historians and educators often think about critical thinking and about why we teach history is going to be fundamentally at odds with those whose basic goal here is to inculcate pride in being an American. After doing that project on the writing of the standards in Michigan, as part of that, I was going into classrooms, and it's often said that great teachers don't spend a lot of time with textbooks and are mostly using primary sources. But I did visit classrooms for that reporting, and I found many teachers had a big American history textbook right on their podiums or on their desk, and it was like sticky notes all over it. So I said to myself, look, we might not want these things to matter, but they still do. And I decided to actually embark upon a crazy project, which was to go to the publishers, all the top publishers, and demand obnoxiously that they give me all of their books published since 2016. I did receive 43 American history textbooks, and with a colleague, we read 7,000 pages of American history textbooks. This was extremely boring, guys. I mean, these are not well written. They are written by committee. Some great historians have participated in the writings of these books, but then when I called them after, they'd be like, oh yeah, like this bears little resemblance to what the draft I turned in. So these are really written by committee documents. You can, if you just Google my name and textbooks, it's going to pop up. It was published in early 2020, right before the pandemic. I'll just describe my findings from that briefly. Slavery was much more frankly discussed than it was even 20 years ago. The torture, disease, and death of the Middle Passage, the plantation, the auction block were presented in much more vivid detail than books did, even in the recent past, and this is true in both conservative and liberal states. I particularly focused on California and Texas because, as you all know, those are the biggest textbook markets, and the standards produced for those states often trickle out to the rest of us across the country. There was very little or even no myth-making around the kindness of white masters, which I am in my late 30s and is a change even from what I recall in my student years. There was much more on the displacement and brutal genocide of Native Americans and stories that I think are really important for children to hear, such as Native American boarding schools, for example. So there were some really big positive changes that are worth celebrating. There were some shared failures across California and Texas, a red state and a blue state. Very little on the role of debates over slavery in the founding of the nation and in the crafting of the founding documents. So that's a silent point in these books. But there was one really big difference between California and Texas, and that was the depth of white resistance to Black progress and all sorts of racial progress after the Civil War. So, for example, Texas tells a cliched and optimistic history of the 1950s and suburbanization in this country. Nothing about housing discrimination, nothing about the persistence of school segregation post-Brown v. Board. This is very different in California, where redlining is specifically called out, and there's model lessons that you can do around restrictive clauses from rental contracts and things like that. So very big difference. So being mindful of time, I will fast forward a bit and tell you about some of the news on this beat that I am watching as a reporter. I am looking at state laws on how race is taught, not just those from the right, but also ones from the left that are requiring racial and ethnic history to be taught, such as the Black and Latino Studies bill here in Connecticut, the California Ethnic Studies law. Vermont and Washington also seem to be moving in the direction of requiring some type of ethnic studies. There are 8 state chapters of a group called Make Us Visible, which is fighting for AAPI education in schools, and 5 bills have been passed, including in Connecticut. I would argue that these laws too need to be critically considered for the following reasons. Is the overwhelmingly white teaching force prepared to teach this curriculum, and what training are they going to be getting to be presenting this material to kids? And then I think there's a tension, as we saw in California. Do you have Californians here? Okay, so there's a tension between how the academy thinks of something like ethnic studies. There are specific racial and ethnic groups that are under that umbrella, the way that discipline has been crafted in the academy, and what the popular public, parents, and other people that are active and have a stake in education think about when they hear the term ethnic studies, which is they may think like Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans ought to be included here. And this debates over this actually really have shaped the rollout of this in California, and I think that's probably likely to continue to happen as this goes across the country in the blue states, where I think it can and probably should continue to be discussed and debated. But I think when the typical person hears ethnic studies, they are sometimes thinking that there's a space for something that is not actually in the academic study traditionally of ethnic studies, and this leads to conflict. I just want to end with some poll results about what the public wants us to teach kids, because I think it's important as we have this very motivated right-wing movement. How do you respond to that? I do think it's helpful to know what people generally think. And these numbers come from the recent study published by scholars at USC Rossier School of Education, led by Morgan Polikoff. So for high school, there is very strong support across both self-identified Republicans, Democrats, and independents as well for teaching hard history. I'm just going to zoom in on my phone to this graphic. The number one most popular thing to teach high school students is critical thinking, 97%. Number 2 is about the US economy. And number 3 is slavery. Right up there is contributions of women and people of color, 94%. And it goes on like that, voting rights, the environment, all above 80% support for teaching these things to high school students. Income and racial inequality, above 85% support. So I think that there's very broad support for discussing the nation's history with teenagers. If you go down to elementary school, the numbers are not as high, but they're still quite positive. The most controversial thing to teach in America right now is actually about gender and sexuality. And that is going to continue to rear its head. I just want to end with the idea that patriotism is something that many, many, many people would like their children to come out of the school system with, a sense of pride in being an American. So I think as we think about how do we teach hard history, we should also acknowledge the fact that this is something that the public in these polls repeatedly say that they want. Thanks.
All right. Let's check the clicker. Okay. All right. So first, I just want to say thank you to David and all the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to learn from so many wonderful presenters, but also from the great questions from the audience. I just have to say before I jump into my remarks that I was reading last night our child's school newsletter, and what do I see but the Gilder Lehrman Center immigration curriculum is one that is being taught in the 7th grade in our daughter's school.
Way to go, Tom.
So I was very excited to see that we are already taking advantage of the wonderful resources that are produced by the Gilder Lehrman Center. All right, so the question for the panel is very much, why do we teach U.S. history? And I'm going to provide a couple of aspirational answers to that question. Obviously, there's many answers to this question, and these are aspirational. So one thing that I'm hopeful of, and I saw this some in the comments of one of the teachers last night who spoke, is that we have a long history of resistance, resilience, and reform in the United States. And I think that's a story that we can draw upon and draw in the various histories of many people, not just the colonialists who are resisting the British, right? And so the story I want to tell today of resistance is through law governing the education of enslaved peoples. And then second, the other thing I think is often overlooked and that my work really tries to do is to help people understand how inequality is just baked into our American education system. And as we educate this generation about that, they are then empowered with the information to seek to change it. But so often it's just sort of assumed that we have separate and unequal schools too often. And that reality is shaping our democracy, our criminal justice system, our health outcomes, all of that is happening. And so one of the things I try to make sure people sort of think about, including in history, is why are we even here? Like, why do we have public schools? What are we doing? So that's going to be just a minor point to the end. I'm going to focus on the laws governing slavery for a bit. So one of the things that I do in my class, I teach a class, race, education, and race and education and law at the University of Virginia. And again, like so many people I heard this weekend, my students are like, why did I never learn this in school? Mind you, I'm teaching graduate students, right? So they have already gone through K-12, succeeded, they've done well in college, and they're at one of the top law schools in the country. And they acknowledge that they have not heard most of what we are talking about, right? And so what we talk about is first, when we talk about understanding enslaved people and education, it's important to understand not only that slavery was a system of compulsory ignorance, but also that there was a long history of resistance to that compulsory ignorance. And teaching about enslaved people through that lens really changes how you explain the story. So many of us, I'm over 50, I won't say how much over 50, but I'm over 50. And the story of slavery, when it was told at all, was a very distorted, inaccurate picture. But when you understand really the reality of what slaves were doing to resist their enslavement, you help students understand that sense of agency, that it was not just the colonialists who were resisting the British, it's also the enslaved who were resisting those who were enslaving them. And so what you see is that not only were those who were enslaved seeking to escape through the Underground Railroad, slaves were teaching each other to read. They were creating schools to learn to read, often that were hidden. Some masters actually taught their slaves to read to assist them with work. And the mistresses also, out of Christian obligation, would teach those who were enslaved to read. And the children of slave owners often, as they were learning to read, they were teaching those who were caring for them to learn to read. And then some who were enabled to leave the plantation to help do their master's work would often be seeking information about how to read just as they were out doing the task for their masters. In addition to those who were enslaved, you also had free Africans who were not only running schools, but also doing Sabbath schools, apprenticeships, other things to teach each other to learn to read. And so what's critical to understand is that law was one of the key mechanisms used to deny enslaved people how to read. So if you look at this timeline, what you'll see is that so early in the 1700s, you have Spain encouraging rebellion in the English colonies among the slaves. Why? Not because they care about those who are enslaved, because it's a power struggle, right, for the colonies. And so what you see is that those in Spain would grant freedom to slaves who escaped and got to Florida. I know Florida has been a big topic of conversation, but at the time, those in Spain were saying, if you get to Florida, you can be free. We can discuss that, what that means today, but that was what's happening. And so in 1938, the Spanish produced an edict that encouraged insurrection, basically to undermine and destabilize the economy. So what happened? There was the Stono Rebellion, you see that on the chart. In 1739, there was a large group of slaves. It originally began as 2 people, grew to as many between 60 to 100, and they engaged in rebellion against their masters. And they secured firearms and definitely killed 20 settlers at least. And they were seeking to establish their freedom. They were then eventually defeated by the militia the next day. But what you see in response to that rebellion, this is in South Carolina, they immediately pass a law. What is the law about? Reading. The response to armed militia was about reading. Why is that? Because illiteracy is a tool of oppression, and literacy is a tool of freedom. And they understood that by keeping the population that was enslaved without the ability to read, they could better control what they were doing. And so this symbol of racial and cultural superiority was that ability to read. And so they were seeking to deny the humanity of those who were enslaved. But here is the wonderful story that I tell my students through this particular slide, and I give them the actual text of the laws throughout the colonies that prohibited teaching slaves to read. And I can recommend to you a wonderful book about this, Andrea Williams, Self-Taught, African-American Education in Slavery and Freedom. I highly recommend this book. It's a wonderful read. So what do we see in these laws? What you see in this table is that numerous states have multiple places where they're passing laws prohibiting teaching slaves to read. Why do you need more than one? Why is there more than one? Because of the resistance that was happening to these laws. And so I just pulled up one example so that you could see the text of it yourself. There's multiple examples in the laws, but notice at first in 1740, right after this rebellion, there is a law enacted to prohibit all and every person who shall teach a slave to write. There's a punishment of a financial punishment, and that is the initial act. But then notice 60 years later, they then broaden the coverage of this law, and they say any mental instruction whatsoever. Notice it's beyond reading, right? It is saying not only can you not teach them to read, any mental instruction. So that included reading, writing, memorization, arithmetic, and more. All of those things are covered by that. Notice that you then get to corporal punishment, not to exceed 20 lashes, right? It was clear that they had to increase coverage of what you could not do, and they had to make the punishment more severe. Why? because those who were enslaved were still resisting and seeking to gain that very mental instruction. And then here's one of my favorites. Notice, and this has been mentioned before, but I just want to highlight this trajectory. In 1834, notice they specifically say you cannot have schools. Why is that? Because not only were they resisting those laws, resisting the laws that said you can't teach them to read, but they were creating schools in the face of that resistance to teach each other how to read. And so when I explain this to my students, and there's many other stories that are told in the laws, but this story, the other things that you see are that the punishments continue to get worse. Why? Because the colonies are realizing this population is growing. In some places they are outnumbered. And so they're seeking to not only keep this compulsory ignorance happening, but they are seeking to control this population through ignorance. And if not that, through lashes and imprisonment. So what's important about this is the agency that you see in the enslaved people and how they are seeking to resist those who are enslaving them. Another thing that you can share with them is something called David Walker's appeal. So you'll see that also on the timeline. And then you see further, and I hear some of you already are probably familiar with this. He actually wrote a document in 1829 that called for not only resistance to their slave owners, but violent resistance. That if you were seeking to be killed, what is it for you to seek to kill as well, right? And so he not only calls for that, but he says, and I quote, he says, "America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears." He then asks, "Will they drive us from our property and homes, which we have earned with our blood?" So this claiming early on of this country as belonging to those who work the land is coming from the mouths of those who were brought over here and saying, no, and he's resisting, what he's partly resisting is, well, we should all just go back to Africa. No, this is our land. This is land that we have worked, and our blood, sweat, and tears is in this land, and it is important that we stake our claim to this land. And what do you see in response to that? You see multiple laws saying, not only do we not want this pamphlet distributed, so this distributed found its way all the way through the South, and for example, in Georgia, when they seized about 60 copies of this document, 10 days later, the legislature passes a law saying not only can you not distributing documents that incite people to resist, but also prohibiting allowing slaves to read so that they could never read such a document that says essentially overthrow those who are enslaving you. And so I just think it's important that we understand, and the laws really tell the story of this repeated resistance, but also resilience. The resilience that it takes to teach someone to read at the threat of lashes is a resistance that really, frankly, we need today. That same resilience in the face of the laws that are seeking to suppress information and suppress the teaching of a more inclusive understanding of our nation's history is a resilience that we need to draw upon from those who were enslaved. And then finally, I'll just end with this point. There is a through line from what is happening with the compulsory ignorance during our nation's earliest history and the deprivation that we see in our public schools today, particularly in the resources that are provided to Black and Brown children. So I'll give you a statistic that always sticks with people. EdBuild, an organization that does education research, found that there was a $23 billion gap between schools that were 75%, school districts that were 75% white or more and 75% non-white. And this is a recent study after decades of school finance litigation sought to close those gaps. And so what you see in America today is that too often we are relegating Black and Brown children to schools that are seeking to build on this legacy of compulsory ignorance. And it is that framing of education that I think we need to help all of our children understand so that we may dismantle it together and build a more perfect union.
Daryl, you're on.
Absolutely.
Mix it up.
No. I'm just going to say a few things. I was really upset after the last session, and I've been known to toss a presentation and speak off my cuff. But part of why I was upset tells me I shouldn't, because I believe in intellectual discipline, and I believe in intellectual responsibility. The things we say and do have consequences sometimes that are more important than we are individually. Other thing I want to say, and it's becoming a mantra, we will not exterminate our enemies, and our enemies will not exterminate us. I shared an army with racists and white nationalists. We purged them and they're back. History is long. There is no such thing as progress. And justice, the arc of justice, does not bend towards freedom and truth. History don't love nobody. Nobody. So what we do and say, how we fight, and who we fight matters. Since the election of Barack Obama, America has witnessed a rather precipitous decline in multiculturalism and a concomitant rise of ethno-racial consciousness among Blacks and whites. The word multiculturalism is hardly used anymore. Many Black folks associated with neoliberalism, and there was nothing but a lot of political effort for small political gains. And most whites never saw anything in it, not even in the corporate version of multiculturalism. I spent 13 years of my career putting aside my own work to pursue Carter G. Woodson's mission of multicultural education. So this touches me deeply when Black teachers in Oklahoma can't teach Black history. They could before this current culture war. And I'm here to tell you, liberals win wars about rights. We lose culture wars. I don't like cultural warriors, left to center. Now, Woodson believed in education for democracy. I'm here today because this institution, the Gilder Lehrman Institution, believes in culture for democracy. Woodson used to say that when we teach that beautiful Black history, Black people would be inspired to press for their rights. And they would teach white people that Black people had a history, had nothing to be ashamed of, and that they deserved a seat at the table in a democratic society. If we, and would result, he believed this would result, well, never print front to back, but anyway, he believed in mutual respect and democracy, and now we have to get back to this belief in multiculturalism, in multicultural education. One of the things I'm here I'm learning here is that most of us want to reduce the current assault on inclusive education to the foul politics of the Republican Party and their right-wing operatives who manipulate parents, who then in turn go to school boards and pretend something adverse is happening to their children. What I see is something different, something my colleagues have long denied in this profession. We're witnessing the resurgence, not simply of white supremacy, but white supremacy not as racism, but white supremacy as white nationalism. Look for books by US historians on white nationalism, you won't find it. For all our tough talk about things, we haven't even studied the most profound tradition in American history. But we think of ourselves as radical. Many feel that since Obama, this resurgence has begun. It began before then. I don't disagree with much of anything anyone has said about aspects of this problem. I am not on the other side, I'm on your side. I agree with most everything that was said. I recall when whiteness scholars argued that whites do not have to be self-conscious because whiteness is normalized in the culture. Well, folks, whites are now self-conscious. All of you who don't see change, they're self-conscious whites in places where they didn't used to be. This is not the same struggle. I didn't see it in Wisconsin in the 80s, nor in Minnesota in the 70s. White nationalism has spread across the land, and it's deeper than republicanism, it's deeper than Trump. We might say republicanism has gone back to its roots because the Republican Party was founded on the concept of opposing slavery in the West, not for the sake of a multicultural democracy, but for the sake of white men only. So the Republican Party has come full circle. And they wrote constitutions that said only whites were citizens in places like Iowa and Oregon. But there's no such thing as white nationalism. If this consciousness is more than a fad, then we better change how we deal with our enemies. We don't serve ourselves well by calling them orcs. We don't. I watch videos of Ukraine and Russia day and night. I'm an old soldier, never fought in the war, thank God. But the Ukrainians call the Russians orcs. They demonize their enemies. The Russians want to exterminate the Ukrainians, who are ultra-nationalists, they say. Nazis, they say. The Russians will not exterminate the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will not exterminate the Russians. And you will not exterminate conservatives. And let's start acting like it. Let's start acting like we share a country, like we're gonna share a country. We ain't going nowhere. They're not going anywhere. We gotta make this work. And multicultural democracy is the best bet at the level of education. We have to, we know that the assault on critical race theory is false. And for the record, I've been a critical race theorist my whole life because I never believed you were going to eliminate racism. I never one day believed it. I teach at Black schools for a reason, because I believe in Black people and I believe in the ongoing struggle. But that struggle has to be waged in such a way that we don't put our individual right of freedom of speech to serve the cause of our enemies. Discipline matters. How you fight your fight matters. Just like how you teach your students matter. And that's why I'm here. I'm here because I know what it means to teach people very different from me. And I know that all kids present themselves to you as teachers, as innocent individuals who want to learn, who want to feel good about themselves. And what I'm saying is that sometimes we do what we do in such a fashion that when we say whiteness is not real, but Blackness is, when you say that race is not real and that it's only skin deep, and it started out as white skin privilege before it became white supremacy equals racism equals whiteness. It started out as white skin privilege, and that they have no culture because Western culture is not a monolith. But if you are dealing with a white kid who believes that, and if you basically say who they are and who they think they are is illegitimate, you kid yourself if you believe you are not doing them harm if you are not careful about how you teach them the historical truths that we all believe in. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I want to thank David for inviting me and persuading me to participate in this. He was right. I did tell him, David, I don't even know if I'm going to be in the country. I had this idea that I was going to escape the madness by going to Italy. I heard Jason earlier say, you know, this is not just an American phenomenon. Of course, he's right about that. But I am going to talk about it as a distinct phenomenon right now, partly because something really important is about to happen on Tuesday. And everything that we've been talking about here is at play in what's going to happen on Tuesday and what's going to happen afterwards. So, you know, what I thought I might do, partly because I'm trying now more than ever to bridge the discourses that I engage in here and what I do out there. What I do out there, and one of the reasons I also am in the country was my organization joined what we called Freedom Writers, from Freedom Writers to Freedom Readers, the Books Unbanned tour. And we've just gotten back from traveling to 15 states and 24 cities to try to make concrete to voters what we've been talking about over the last couple days. So I have a little clip to show you, sort of put us in the mood.
God trouble, a 14-state, 26
Is it trying to find itself?
How to get into good trouble. A 14-state, 26-city tour. One, two, one.
We know that the same people who want to change the rules when we start winning elections want to change the rules when we start going out and protest and millions of people join us. The same people who were upset when we took to the streets in all 50 states after the murder of George Floyd are the same people who have decided that they want to take the language of structural racism, of racial injustice, of social justice out of our mouths, out of our studies, out of our books. We have decided that just like the freedom riders who said, you don't get to tell us where to sit, you don't get to tell us where to eat, you don't get to tell us what to drink, we've decided you don't get to tell us what to read, you don't get to tell us what to teach, you don't get to tell us what to learn. So what we've done is decided to give 6,000 books away, all of the titles that they don't want us to learn. So what we want you to do is help yourself to books that we have brought here for you. We want you to join us as freedom readers. This connects our history of fighting for our right to be part of this democracy, our right to exercise power. And we know that people who do not know their history are what? They're bound to repeat it. Well, I know about me, I'm not willing to repeat the history of losing our political power. I'm not willing to repeat the history of having our stories erased from textbooks. I'm not about to repeat the history where they tell us where to go and what to do.
It is the difference between our fight for Black excellence and the reality of a world that doesn't want to see that happen. We're going to make sure that this nation feels the heat, feels the passion, feels the impact of the Black vote.
So yes, Black voters matter. Yes, Black books matter. Black voters matter. Black books matter. Black voters matter. Black books matter. See you November 8th. Thanks. So I wanted to start there, partly because I know some part of this conversation was meant to address what is to be done. And our sense is part of what is to be done is to take the conversation to the people and make it concrete for them. So a lot of parents, they've heard about the ban on divisive concepts, they've heard about the ban on critical race theory. They don't know it means taking the bluest eye out of the curriculum. They don't know it means we can't talk about Ruby Bridges. They don't know it means that elements of their own story can't be taught to their children anymore. So we thought making it concrete actually helps advance what needs to be the connection between the fact that the same forces that are trying to gerrymander their way into permanent minority rule are also trying to gerrymander our history. And there was no better way to do it than that. But I also wanted to start off on a bit of a high note because what I want to add to this conversation is to turn the gaze a little bit more inward and to talk about the levels of discomfort and ambivalence around discussions about racism in history that continues to occupy much of the space within liberal progressive spaces. So let me start by giving just a quick story. We got back about a week ago. I was having dinner with a group of friends, mostly white liberal friends in organizations that do the work that we all support. And I was telling them that we went through Wilmington and I was really disturbed to go to the site where the newspaper was burned down at the beginning of the Wilmington riot. I thought, well, the Wilmington coup. And what I thought would be there was some kind of placard, some kind of claim, some kind of, this is what happened here. And there's nothing there, nothing at that site. It's an empty lot. And I connected it to the way I felt when then President-elect, in response to January 6th, said, "This is not who we are." And it made me wonder what history books did he not have access to? What part of our national story was never told? What part of the fact that we have had violent coups before, that our history of democracy is checkered at best? This is exactly who we've been. So I tell this story to my friends, and I was actually surprised. What I got back from them was pushback on, well, you know, it's not, I'm sure he knows that history, but he's reaching for an aspiration. He wants to embody the best of what we might become. And my response to that is, you don't get somewhere by not starting from an honest assessment about what road you've been on. You don't get to substitute what you want to be for what is and what has been. And it was interesting, that conversation went on for not a little bit of time. It was quite a debate. And I take well the point that you were making, Dana, because there was a sense that, well, first there has to be the recognition of patriotic pride. And what he was leaning into was trying to capture that, to say, this is not who we are. And what I was also leaning into was saying that patriotic pride is precisely the piece of the sweet spot between the conservatives and the white nationalists who are trying to pursue this project, and elements on our side who are also ambivalent about how much of that stuff, how much of that ugly stuff, do we want to accept as part of who we are. So that it all reminded me of a quote from Justice Marshall, who said, "Patriotic feelings should not get in the way of thoughtful reflection on this country's continued struggle for equality." Well, that is exactly what is getting in the way. And we have to be able to acknowledge that there is a sweet spot between those who want to make this racial history unnameable and those who want to circumvent the racial history because it's uncomfortable. So one of the dimensions of critical race theory that I think is relevant to this moment is that critical race theory came directly from the ambivalence of some of our liberal allies in liberal institutions around how much they had to be transformed in order to really make room for the new generations of students who are coming through those doors. Critical race theory, and I will take a moment to define it only because I was told I must. And in fact, because critical race theory is the framework under which this pushback happens, it is important for us to talk about it. So critical race theory is the pursuit of generations of post-civil rights era students who, upon our arrival in elite institutions, law schools in particular, we wanted to understand how it is that decades after landmark cases, civil rights laws were passed, that the multidimensional apparatus upon which white supremacy was built was largely uncontested. How was it that law was not simply a neutral referee, but an active participant in structuring our racial order? So we reflected on these questions. We interrogated how education and knowledge-making disciplines historically had shorn up the status quo rather than having interrogating it. It was and is a set of tools for uncovering, unearthing, revealing how the foundations of the Republic continue to find expression through practices and values that have been insufficiently tied to the history of enslavement, genocide, settler colonialism. It is the recognition that while we might be a post-slave, post-genocidal, post-colonizing society, we will never be one that was not grounded in those foundations. Now, if these features were justified by law through various articulations of racism, then just like the asbestos that's packed into our institutions, critical race theory is the blueprint that endeavors to reveal where this continues to exist, how these ideas, these frameworks endanger our democracy, and what practices we need to use to diminish its toxicity. But CRT is more than academic knowledge, and this is something the right knows far better than our liberal left allies, as we've heard and as they have attempted to do by demonizing every concept that incorporates the reality that we do not live in a colorblind world, that colorblind lenses will not provide the explanations and the capacity to sustain the very hard work that's necessary to make good on the basic guarantees of a multiracial democracy. Given that this is what the anti-CRT people are trying to eliminate, then it is clear that CRT is everything that we do that acknowledges that this is not the country that we live in, everything that we do to acknowledge that we have to have racial knowledge in order to survive in this society. For CRT, for some of us, it's not indoctrination into falsehoods, it's the daily practices that we have to adapt in order to deal with the continuing dimensions of racism in this society. So it's the reason that some of us place our hands at the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock position when we see those flashing lights in our rearview mirror. It's the talk that many of us have to give our children to improve their odds of surviving such encounters. It's the mirror that we hold up to our society. It's the recognition that if people are unaware of the policies, the politics, and the practices that created segregated housing markets, the criminal injustice system, gaping wealth and health disparities, and more, if they are not told these stories, then they will default to understanding these conditions as natural, as neutral, as just there, leaving efforts to redress them to be framed as preferential, reverse discrimination, un-American. This is what CRT is. By these measures, then, most of us in this room are critical race theorists. Thanks to the right, we're all critical race theorists now. But here's the problem. Thinking that about finding what critical race theory actually is allows this racial panic to function as a Trojan horse for anti-democrats to eviscerate the achievements of the civil rights movement, to reboot the last 70 years, to destroy the democratic routes that brought us this far. It obscures how the road to fascism in this country is likely paved by white supremacy. So while people pore over what's happening around the world looking for signs of democratic collapse, they seem to overlook what's in plain sight. Faculty being barred from testifying in lawsuits in Florida, teachers being made to take loyalty oaths in New Hampshire, monitors being placed in classrooms, and bounties being placed on teachers for exposing children to divisive concepts like the history of genocide and segregation. When we see the banning of more than 1,000 books nationwide, including those by Toni Morrison, civil rights pioneer Ruby Bridges, whose own story of desegregating New Orleans public schools is taken out of the curriculum because it might cause feelings of guilt and anguish to white students. When we see foreign nations exploiting our racist tendencies to execute effective disinformation campaigns that drive us apart, we can see that it is because of the unfinished business of confronting our legacies that make the question of whether it can still happen here the question it is, given the fact that it already has. It's only by separating our histories, Black history in particular, from American history, that our president and many others can say, this is not who we are. So we can and should do more to gather together our overlapping constituencies to protect the legacies of the last 70 years. At minimum, we need to be about defending our teachers in the trenches. We need to be about advancing academic freedom in our faculty senates. We need to be about demanding real reporting in our editorial desks, real accountability in our boardrooms, real history in our classrooms, and sustained actions to democratize our institutions. If the histories that so many folks in this conference have told us means anything, it means that the pursuit of freedom and democracy is not a one and done scenario. We don't get to keep what was won in one generation without struggles to name it, to retain it, to institutionalize it, and to protect it. And here, in conclusion, I'll come back to what is personal for me. I don't want to be that generation that fails to pass the baton to the next generation in a better position than the one I received it in. I don't know whether the moral arc of the universe bends to justice, but I do know one thing. It won't do so without a far more robust commitment on our part to learn the histories and be comfortable speaking them if we mean not to repeat them. And with November 8th looming and the Supreme Court poised to constitutionally secure a racially unjust status quo into the far future, I'm feeling like we're bending more to the direction of 1876 than to the multiracial promised land. I'm feeling like Du Bois, of course, was right to say that the challenge of the 20th century was the challenge of the color line. Its descendant that we have to come to terms with, if we're fully to confront what undermines our solidarity right now in the 21st century, is the distortions of the colorblind. Thank you.
That's a little like Moses came down off the mountain and said, "It ain't over. Let me read these 10 things to you again, because you've forgotten them." Boy, thank you, Kim. You just reminded me of a time I saw Herbert Aptheker at many years ago in the 90s at UMass. It was a conference about Du Bois, and Aptheker didn't even really give a talk. He just got up and said, "Du Bois never quit. Du Bois never quit." It's about all he said. And that was the easy times of the 90s. Okay, well, I have hands up already. So Bev, go ahead.
Thanks for a really terrific panel. I am very curious about a theme that came up in many of your comments, which is this theme about patriotism, love of country. One thing that I have found a little troubling in our current politics is the way in which patriotic symbols, things like the American flag, have been kind of branded in a particular way to stand for particular things, and there are large swaths of the public who now roll their eyes at something like hanging a flag. So I wonder how any of you reconcile this question that Dana posed, but that many of you were addressing, which is, is it possible or important to kind of face the really complicated parts about American history and still to love your country or take pride in your country? Does it matter? Is that the wrong equation? Can you do that? Is there, there's a way in which patriotism itself has become a partisan issue, and that seems troubling to me, but I'm just wondering if you think that's the wrong framing or if you have a synthesis of those things.
Daryl, as a veteran, go for it. Take the mic right to your mouth. Apparently, that's how it gets recorded.
We yielded the flag on the left to the right somewhere in the 50s, the latest in the 60s. They've had the flag. Liberals, for instance, American exceptionalism starts out as a liberal ideology. Yeah. And for the Republicans, today it's a borrowed ideology. The real ideology, again, is harsher than you think. These folks are now white nationalists. They are claiming America in the same way that Southern whites in the 1850s still thought themselves American patriots. When they fought the war, they thought they were the true Americans. And so as they morphed, they kept the flag. And then, as you know, they combined it with Nazis and the Confederate flag. and even across the world, the Confederate flag. So these two flags fly together now. The same white Americanism that Southerners of the lost cause generation touted and has been accepted. And we, in some of our politics, we have seeded into them, coming out of the 60s with, it wasn't universal, a kind of anti-Americanism in the movement.
I saw Jason's hand, and I see other hands. So we'll go right there first while you got the mic, and then if we can. Oh, you got the mic. Okay. All right. Well, all right.
Hello again from the Adirondacks, and thank you for
Okay.
awesome panel. Yes. My very quick question to go on the theme of exceptionalism is there a way, after, I taught Eastern European history here at TF a few years ago. My students did not seek anything inspirational or exceptional from Eastern European history. I had to come to the sun shone in Eastern Europe sometimes, because they thought it was just entirely gloom, nothing but horrible things. But when you learn your own country's history, because you want to find your place in there, you want it to somehow inform your story, it seems as though exceptionalism is to some extent inevitable to come across. Something about what makes you matter in this moment, what history brings you to this place. And so I'm just curious, is there a way to make space for exceptionalism while telling the full story? If this was a great immigration place to bring Eastern European migrants who could have their farm in North Dakota, who had to lose that land? What environmental damage was done to that land? Who wasn't allowed to move to that land? That doesn't take away the American dream, but it complicates it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Connor. Anybody want to comment? I don't want to.
Go ahead, David.
No. Well, this won't work if it does? Yes, okay. Is that a yes? All right. Well, yeah, I think you can if you stop and say, you know, this is exceptional, but exceptional to what? I mean, talk to immigrants. Talk to people who have found a new life here. Talk to that immigrant who's found a new life here, whatever his political party. And if you start by accusing him of white privilege, you've lost him. So, I mean, he probably has a belief set that said this place made my life something different. So, I mean, this is such an old debate. I mean, I can remember a keynote address by Michael Kamen at an OAH, it's got to be 30 years ago, on what is American exceptionalism? It might have even been his presidential address, I don't remember now. And man, did he complicate it. There's a great essay he did about where American exceptionalism comes from in our culture, as only Kamen could. And it's had so many different uses, including by the left at times. The left can be exceptionalist about America too. There used to be a time when the study of abolitionism was American exceptionalism. They were saviors. Yeah, some were, some weren't. But it seems to me you've always got to have in mind, exceptional against what? Is there some norm that this is exceptional against? And if we can't even determine what the norm might be, I don't know. You know, look, it's I think American exceptionalism is just all but worn out. We believe it's one of those myths we believe. Whatever we is. But we don't always even know what we mean by it. Anyway, go ahead.
In which we are the makers, African Americans are part of the makers of American exceptionalism. You know, it starts out on the issue of labor and class. But people like Frederick Douglass, people like David Walker, people like the 1619 Project, they take the Declaration of Independence and they say, live up to these great ideals. So on one hand, they're saying there's nothing exceptional about you, but if you do these things, we will be what we claim to be. So we keep this whole thing alive. And at some level, what nation doesn't like to think of itself as different, important, and in some ways better? What nation? No nation has a negative self-image and lasts for very long. It's problematic when it gets mobilized in a way for imperialist purposes, and even Frederick Douglass fell prey to that when he felt that Haiti would be better if brought into the United States.
Douglas became a soft imperialist. He was. No, over here. Okay. End of the road. Go ahead.
Most of my question is, I'm like, I think this panel like really crystallized my takeaways from this conference. I feel so inspired. But I keep thinking about what was mentioned earlier about shifting how we teach history from the what to the how. I'm thinking back to what you were talking about, Dr. Roberts, about how the law in many ways is reactionary as opposed to kind of how most students see it. You know, when I'm even thinking back to your work on colorblindness in the law. And I'm just thinking, you know, oftentimes in this debate, we see a lot of people, because of the demonization of CRT, go, okay, well, no, we're not teaching it. But in many ways, there's a lot that we can get it. Like in many ways, I am teaching critical race theory in my classroom. I'm teaching my students how the law is reacting to resistance, how it's reacting to being challenged through white supremacy. So I'm just wondering, how do we bring nuance to this conversation for educators? And again, more about how can we shift our learning objectives to not being about the what, how are communities coming together? How are people challenging the law? And then getting our students to think about, and kind of in many ways, getting our students to unlearn what they see as very stable aspects of their society. Like a lot of students see the law as being very stable. Many students see it as being kind of like the mediator. This is the law, if it's in the law, it's good. Whereas that's not actually the case. So I just wonder if you all have any thoughts on that.
I wanted to build off what Deja was saying, that, and that was making me think as well that I think we should be posing these questions to our students. I don't think we should, and Layla was talking yesterday about how fifth and sixth graders are totally capable of having these really sophisticated discussions. And so in the best case scenario, rather than us deciding and making some kind of determinative decision, we are grappling with these things in real time with our students, and we're asking them, here's a lot of evidence, and where do you, like, how do you make sense of this? And we also talked about the various people over the course of the conference, the kind of false dichotomies, and the idea that either you are entirely patriotic or you are teaching art history, and that these two things have to happen at odds with each other, and both are possible.
It's a great book by a theologian named Donald Shriver called Honest Patriots. And he does a deep analysis. He is a Protestant theologian, just recently died. He does a deep historical analysis of many forms of patriotism in the American experience. But he does it through this lens of, well, what he called honesty, which always means confronting the past. I'd recommend it highly. Anyway, Nasser, and then Jason. I'm sorry, Jason's already got the mic.
Got a couple of answers to her question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kimberly, my fault.
So what I want to share is simply that when we think about how we are teaching children, or college students, or graduate students about the law, really they merely reflect what our values are. And because our values in our nation are so deeply contested, we will see a reflection of a wide variety of values. White supremacy is a value we see in the law, but we also see many laws that favor equality, equity, justice. And so I think it's important, I was encouraged in the last couple of days of the stories of just students being able to hold those contested stories, right? and understand that the law can be a stabilizing force, it can be a force for good, and it also can be a force to oppress. And I think as long as students get that more nuanced picture, then they will push for the laws that reflect the values that we are inspiring. And to go back actually to that first question about patriotism, I absolutely think we should push against this capturing of patriotism by the right. You know, one of the things that I enjoy about teaching about race is it always inspires me to just have a greater pride in the descendants, the enslaved people that I came from, who fought and survived so much. You know, the women survived violent crimes, they raised their families, and they pushed for freedom. That is an incredible legacy. That's something my husband and I talk with our daughters about. Like they took kings and queens and leaders in their country and brought them and enslaved them, and yet we rose. And so that is part of the American story. And I think as we, tell these richer histories with broader, more inclusive history, we can claim America as our own because it was built on our backs. And so if we cede it, if we cede the flag, shame on us because we built this nation.
I wanted to also suggest that Professor Robinson in her talk, I think, outlined a common thread through so much of our history, which is the story of resistance. And, we often start with the story of white, colonists resisting the British Empire, but the thread of resistance and the theme of resistance goes through all of our history. And so I think that's good. And I wanted to, in terms of strategies for the classroom, I wanted to share with you a bit of the end of the story about observing the conservatives and progressives coming together in Michigan, because one of the things they wanted to do was to come up with a list of the nation's quote-unquote core values that they would put into the social studies standards and that would guide teachers in their instruction, and they were actually able to come to consensus. So I'd like to read to you what they came up with.
Miracle.
So these are called the core democratic values, and they're the Michigan state standards, and they are equality, liberty, justice and fairness, unalienable individual rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, consent of the governed, truth, and the common good. And so after that list was defined, I asked a teacher, Becky Debowski, in a small rural town in Michigan, how does she plan to actually use this list? Like, what does this list mean to her? And she was like, I love this list because for every topic in American history I discuss with my kids, including slavery, including Reconstruction, I can put this list up. And she has it posted in her classroom. There's posters and everything that you can buy in the state of Michigan if you're a teacher. Do we have any Michiganders? Any? Okay.
Originally.
All right. So she said, I put this list up and I say, what's the country living up to its stated written values in our founding documents in these moments, in these incidences, or even in our historical remembering of them? So I think that that was one way that she was trying to get to a type of history that would be true and somewhat patriotic.
So I'm grappling with this conversation. I think it's interesting. I want to remind us of one thing, then maybe I can make an additional comment. On the question of when the left conceded the flag and patriotism, what comes to mind for me is Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the Olympics. They're playing the national anthem. They're not saying, I don't want you to play the national anthem. They're not saying, I'm not going to salute the flag. But they are saying, I'm not going to suppress my experience as a Black American, an ongoing contradiction with what all this stuff is supposed to be about. And they were written out of their profession because of it. Now, patriotism means that we need to be on the side of those who wanted to write them out. then I can't really get that. If patriotism means I'm gonna run the race, I'll represent my country, but I am not gonna be silent about the terms of my existence, then I can get with that. What worries me is that there is a sense that what comes first is, first tell me you love us, and then we'll talk. And I wanna say, no, first tell me you love us, and then we'll talk. And that, I think, is just a conversation that has not yet been resolved, and we've had that conversation for centuries. My second worry is right now, patriotism is being used to erase the contradiction. Like, we don't want to hear about the fact that there is any tension between American reality and these aspirations. So having had this debate for so long, now the next move on the chessboard is to put the critique in check. We may not be even able to articulate those things. And that's what worries me as well. The last thing I'll say is about CRT in the classroom. Yes, the point of most of what I'm talking about these days is to say, A, we made a mistake in trying to say, we don't even teach CRT. We made a mistake in trying to pivot away from it, because what the critics are after is not necessarily the name, it is the content of what we're doing. So conceding that there is something that shouldn't be taught in the classroom, I'm just not doing it, is basically losing half the battle, because then the next stage is just to say, no, but what you are doing is that same thing. I don't think we want to be in that conversation. We really want to fight for the right to teach what needs to be taught. And debating about whether it's critical race theory or not, I think, has undermined our ability to actually put together a more effective resistance to this moment.
Jason, do you still have the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Daryl. I'm sorry. Dive in.
The people I know who are Black and who consider themselves patriots never make their patriotism contingent upon anything white people say or believe. It's not a conversation with white people. It's an affirmation of the Black experience. And those people feel comfortable with saying, because I'm an American, I have the right to dissent. Because I'm an American, I know you're being un-American. It's not a response, it's not a reaction to white folks. I have lived personally my own life trying to never do anything as a reaction to white people. And I think that a lot of people I served with in the military take that point of view. And I tell you, I can build a whole organization around Black patriotism and bring in people and make it bigger than a solid organization I worked to build for 13 years. It's the biggest unorganized group of people among us.
Wow. Okay, Jason, I've been trying to give you the mic, so go ahead.
Thank you so much for this panel. I'm probably overreacting to Professor Scott's provocative comments, but I'm going to overreact from my perspective, which is very. My parents were brought up in Europe, and you were saying, well, genocide, they're not going to get rid of us, but genocide happens, and Poland was 11% Jewish for 1,000 years. I just got back from Poland. There aren't any Jews in Poland anymore. My family, just like Baldwin says, and Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, when he says, we know you understand our situation here, and that's why we are more upset at you. I mean, someone from my background looks at what's happening here and does worry about genocide. It seems only American exceptionalism would mask that. And leading to the patriotism question and following the Holocaust theme, when I think about what happened post-Holocaust, Jewish patriotism led to Israel, which I have complex and vexed feelings about, and then And then, you know, if you look at the country that's least patriotic now, that's where patriotism is really a bad thing, it's Germany, which is the world's safest liberal democracy, ironically, right now.
Couple of things. I used the word exterminate. I didn't use the word genocide. That was very intentional. Genocide happens. Extermination really does. Okay. Now, I say that as someone who has a set of values. I'm ready to die for it. No, I'm an intellectual, but at bottom, I am not driven by mind. Okay, I just am not. I die for my stuff. So when I say people will not exterminate the other, it's because I believe that people will fight. And I mean, ultimately, they will take up arms. As for Germany and patriotism, I served 2 years in Germany. Never be fooled.
That's also true.
Never be fooled. It's a thin veneer. We were in the gymnasium on a military post that we lived on, the German post. We were told to leave at 6. We were playing basketball. 6 o'clock came. We said, wait. At 6:05, the Germans locked and loaded their weapons on us. That led me to talk to Germans more. Germans have a nationalism and a patriotism that's not far beneath the surface.
Who's next? There's the mic. Okay, now so you go second, but we got the mic over here too. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm an undergrad at Yale.
Could you take the mask down? It's very hard to hear.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm an undergrad here at Yale, and I sort of took issue, I suppose, with a couple of the primary questions that were asked, and I'm sort of curious how you all contend with sort of white liberal ignorance, as exemplified by this like insistence on, I suppose, like patriotism and American exceptionalism, even in a space that presumably is like to be pushing against those things. How do you contend with that type of ignorance while also aiming to push the needle forward in your classrooms or in other settings in which you're sort of having these dialogues and having these discussions?
Don't be in a hurry. I don't think it's a requirement at this university or any other to necessarily fight against exceptionalism or a lot of other isms. I think we're here to debate those isms and to understand them. There are some isms that ought not get the floor, Nazism, but you know, I guess that would be one response I think important to say. We're not here to sanction the nature of questions, even if I disagree, or one of us disagrees.
I'm that liberal. I love debate. I debate people about anything in the classroom, anything, done the right way. It's just the rules of engagement for me. Okay, and by the way, and there's nothing, I say that I'm okay with American exceptionalism, but remember, I'm the guy trying to write the book on white nationalism that a whole profession told me I shouldn't be writing for 30 years. So I take on people all the time.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So just one more
Kimberly.
comment. So part of my comment about patriotism was really not allowing it to be fully defined by conservatives. In other words, I'm just challenging us to push back that the only people who love their nation are conservatives. I think that, you know, as someone who, for example, I worked for the federal government, and I remember after 9/11, the president said the most important thing for you to do as a federal worker is to get back to work. And you have to remember, we were all terrified. We didn't know if another building was going to get struck. But I'll tell you, I got up and went to work because I felt like that was the most patriotic thing that I could do. It was my individual stand against, you know, terrorism. And so there are many ways to be a patriot. A patriot is saying, live up to our values, hold our nation accountable, be the nation we said we were, or even the one that they never intended, but the words can help us get there to give them true meaning. And so this is what I'm saying about being a patriot, is that we don't have to have a patriotism that merely, you know, focuses on the, you know, resistance acts of colonialists and others. We can have a more complicated understanding of patriotism and still say that we're patriots. And so that is what I was alluding to, along with my father also served in the military, in the Air Force, in Germany, actually. And so in our home, there's the flag that was presented to us when he died. You know, that means something to me, that he served our country, even when his country was in many ways rejecting him. And so that is the legacy that I take hold of. It's a complicated one. But it's interesting, I'll share you, my husband challenged me once. He said, you often write about the United States and you don't say our nation in my writing. And I changed it. I said, you know, you're right. I am conceding this nation to other people instead of claiming it for myself. And so that's kind of my personal reckoning with, this is my nation, and it's one that I'm going to help shape to be all that it can be.
You know, it's fascinating, but I was just thinking in response, again, Dana's list of those values and so on and so forth, take the United States off that, take nation off that, take patriotism off that. Those were beliefs. You could believe in all of those passionately and disassociate it with, I mean, they weren't disassociating with the United States, but you could. And those were a bunch of creeds. Maybe except for the one truth. I don't know about that one. Anyway, who's next here? Nasser, go. Right into the mic, buddy.
Thank you, Professor Blake, for letting me have the mic. But yeah,
I'm not controlling.
So I'm thinking, Nation of Islam, 1950s and 60s, Elijah Muhammad sending his children to Medina, Egypt, the Far East, to have a new pedagogy that counted as the ones that I felt like even as I'm reflecting in high school, I was reminded as the Arab other, more importantly the Muslim other, with the picture of the Twin Towers and an American flag in the faded background, right? Always reminding me that I'm the one, that I'm the enemy, especially around everyone looking at me, like I'm the cause of what happened then. And so I guess what I'm wondering from the panel is, I guess in trying to imagine new ways of teaching history that bears witness to the suffering of Black people at home and abroad. How can we borrow from international Black pedagogies that maybe say come from North Africa, takes root in the Soweto uprisings in South Africa, the madrasas in Indonesia that Obama ironically went to when he was a little kid. Like, I'm just curious about that.
All this genius on this panel. Stumped them.
I won't run from that, and we know it's a very complicated story. You know, one of the traditions among African Americans is this notion that we have, since the early republic, reached out around the world to find allies, and that even though our problems are often posed as local ones, we pretty much have been aware that there is a kind of broader context in the world. And those Black folks who went abroad, I used to call them the transatlantic Black elite, and Gilroy comes out and calls it the Black Atlantic world. Now we talk about Black nationalism. And so when we look at that history, there's a history in which there is this dialogue about how do we get white supremacists off our back? How do we teach ourselves and educate ourselves and find a way in the world for ourselves? In the 20th century, this gets to be a much more sophisticated process, taking into account Islam, taking into account freedom movements in other places of the world, taking in, particularly Latin America. It gets to be involved in liberation theology that's coming out of Latin America. And so then there is this rich 20th century tradition that continues on. And to some extent, I actually feel that even though there are a lot of Black internationalists still today, I just don't think it's as rich as it could be, given the relative wealth of some of the elites we have, and given communication, where you don't need as much money as you did 150 years ago. So I can't write the history of what some people are doing today, but I would assure you that there are people out there reaching out around the world. And for instance, Angela Davis, who has been at this, oh God, her whole life, and her kind of a second coming of Angela Davis with anti-mass incarceration. Remember, she still sees this not as a local problem. She wrote a phrase that became a movement when it comes to the 13th Amendment. But she actually believes that mass incarceration is global, and she looks around the world for the source and the end of the problem. And so I think we still do that. And I think it informs a lot of what people.
We're going to take one more over here. Okay, go ahead.
Hi,
Sorry,
so
I'm sorry.
I'm also an undergraduate student. I was wondering where you see institutions of higher education as fitting into this sort of fight. I felt like my experience at Yale, I've been a little bit disappointed. I think there's a sort of lack of urgency here in terms of this fight against this sort of fascist white supremacist push to ban these books, to sort of regulate our education, to censor. And I know perhaps, at a university, you want to encourage intellectual diversity and all the rest, but I think Yale should stand for democracy in sort of the broadest sense. And I know so many professors, so many students have been at the forefront, but as an institution, it feels like there is an extreme lack of urgency. I know on campus we just hosted Pompeo in sort of the name of, or sort of under the guise of expanding our intellectual diversity at this school, which fine, but that doesn't seem to be the sort of event we need to host in this moment. And if that event is to happen at Yale, it seems like we need to be doing a lot more on the other side. And so I'm wondering, sort of all of you, have you felt sort of that same like lack of urgency at institutions of higher education? And what like more can these institutions be doing? I know Yale sent a lot of students to DC to sort of protest, sort of protect affirmative action in Washington, DC. But that sort of feels like Yale protecting its own right to define its admissions process, but can we have that same urgency? Can we sort of fund students to be part of this fight when it comes to sort of banning books in school, when it comes to sort of this mass movement of censorship and sort of the oncoming of fascism in this country, which I feel like we're sort of getting to that place. So just wondering what all of your thoughts are on that.
I have been disappointed but not surprised about the lack of institutional responses across higher education. I mean, I also teach at Columbia. My president is a very well-known First Amendment thinker, and I think that the response of a lot of folks who are well known as defenders of academic freedom and free speech has been surprisingly muted in the face of this. I think there's a tremendous asymmetry in the way that the punditry as well as our thought leaders have dealt with the threat of wokeism, whatever that is, and cancel culture, as opposed to how they deal with legislators basically saying what can and cannot be thought and read and talked about. It's a hugely asymmetrical situation with a hugely asymmetrical response. Part of why my conversation has been, so what are the terms of the conditions of this? Because these are not the people who are behind this legislation. This is not the ALEC of the world, but they are institutions that are in some way or another not seeing this as the threat that it really is. I would say that, I think it was maybe 2017, 2018, I had said that I think universities are going to be the next territory for Trumpism, because universities are the one space that when people go through it, they're less likely to be recruited into Trumpism. So it could not be that universities were going to remain sort of, uncontested spaces. And of course, they have become contested, but not with the kind of response that we would think. My two last thoughts, and one is going to go back to your question. We are about to lose affirmative action. And the real test, I think, for universities is what then will they do to sustain their commitments to diversity as it's framed. I will tell you, as a faculty member that observed what happened when affirmative action was defeated in California, is not much. What they will often not do is interrogate the mechanisms that are now used to sort students into those who are deemed to be eligible and qualified to come into these institutions, without really dealing with, okay, what is the history of these standards? How do they function? How are they still the vehicles for exclusions of the past? People aren't asking that question, and they haven't been asking those questions for at least the last 30 years. In the main decision around which diversity is based, Bakke, there's a famous footnote called footnote 43 that says, if there is a proved bias in the qualifications, in the ways that the admissions processes function, then affirmative action is not preferential treatment, affirmative action is corrective. That's been on the books for decades. No institutions that could make a difference have actually taken that up. So we need to get ahead of this because it's coming. We need to start having the conversations at the highest levels around how are we going to continue operating as though it just happens to be that these institutions now don't have the same numbers of students of color, particularly Black and brown students, that they used to have. And the last thing, I'll come back around to what you said. I think that your question actually raises a very difficult question about how we deal with the legacy of education and its relationship to democracy, because Brown was based on the idea that segregation undermined the potential of Black children to fully participate as citizens in this democracy. So it was tied tightly to the contradiction around what it means to be an American citizen. But it also is limited to what it means to be an American citizen. In other words, the idea that we're citizens of the world The idea that education and ideas that come from many places really has a role in our educational system, that's an uphill struggle in the same way that the idea that human rights regimes that come from other parts of the world have a place in our legal system. We have repudiated both of those ideas. I happen to think one of the reasons why I struggle with the conversation we had about patriotism is that people wrap those things up together. So it means if it works here and it's for us and by us and it's good for us, and if it's not, then why are we even considering it? Now, I think there are good ways of answering that and still doing so with values that we name as American. But I do think that it's a struggle, and it has been a struggle.
Dana, you want to?
Yeah, I love that question, and I, as an education journalist who doesn't have my career inside of the academy, but has done a lot of interviews with admissions officers and school counselors and has reported on this, I wanted to suggest some concrete things that Yale students or students anywhere could advocate for, because affirmative action will be overturned by the Supreme Court. That's really not a question. I mean, I listened to the arguments. It was like a 6-hour pylon. But right now, if you attend a high school that doesn't have, say, advanced placement classes offered or international baccalaureate classes offered, and this high school is also not known as some sort of special school of some kind, that's offering some kind of special elite thing, you are not going to be admitted to an elite college. But there have been experiments run, which my colleague Erica Green has reported on, showing that when we do give a chance to top students at those high schools, and we do allow them to come to our Ivy League colleges, they excel here. You know, maybe they need a little extra support. I think students on these campuses, you need to be advocating for that here from your administration. So I think that's one thing. I mean, we have to look at the kind of credentialism. These colleges, I will be frank, they are looking for sure bets. They are looking for sure bets. And one reason why switching to socioeconomic affirmative action does lead to a decrease in Black, Native American, and Hispanic students is because they're not taking into account the inequality in K-12 that gets into that admission line. So for example, you know, what does the high school provide? I mean, these colleges, and I went to Brown, it's just like, they're all the same, you know? These colleges are looking for students, if you come from not a resource-rich family, they're looking for you to have been plucked from some other elite thing somewhere along your K-12 journey to prepare you to be a Yale student, a Brown student, a Harvard student, whatever it is. It could be a state flagship school also, not just the Ivy League on day one. But I think we need to add more of these colleges because of the role they play. And so these are the types of like accountability to, you know, call a little bit of BS on what I remember. I will always remember this, sitting like on a beautiful green campus at Brown Heights during the first week, and they're welcoming us. And they say, everyone has imposter syndrome here. That term wasn't used back then, but something like that. You deserve to be here. If you're here right now, you deserve to be here. And you know, I think that's messed up. You know, it's like, what did you get to be able to be here? You know, I went to public school. I'm not a legacy, so I could pride myself, well, my school had 30 AP classes or something, such nonsense like that. Somebody else didn't have that. So I think this is what you need to be asking for from your college.
Daryl, then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, quickly. I think that university presidents are already in check for one, if for no other reason but one simple reason. When Trump put a tax in place on endowments, it was a wake-up call to anybody running against a filthy rich university, because now they can just simply increase the taxes on endowments.
Yeah, good point. Look, I have a quick comment there too. I'm sorry, but and I'm not laying this on you. I wish 500 of your classmates were here. In fact, why don't you invite Mira and me, and I'll find someone else to come to residential colleges. Let's expose this question of this conference to your fellow students. I'm doing a course right now called The History Wars. It's great. I got a great group of 18 Yale undergraduates. It's our favorite way of teaching here, those undergrad seminars. And we've read book after book after book about various history wars in American history. At the end of the last class, what was on the table, I forget how it got there, was this question of the triumphal narrative, exceptionalism, nationalism. And so this one student had just written her short paper on this very question. And I said, so, I won't name her, what's your answer to why this survives? She said, who wouldn't want to live in that country? The myth is powerful. But another point, you shouldn't wait around waiting for the university president or his cabinet or even a faculty group to do this. Organize, create a mass movement to support all these teachers. I'm not laying it on you, I'm sorry. But you don't have to wait for Peter Salovey to do this. He's got donors to talk to. He does. So don't wait around for that. Nobody waited around during the Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement. Actually, at Michigan State, where I was an undergraduate, we had a president. He was an interim, so he knew he didn't have to stick it out very long. He was incredible. He was an economist named Walter Adams. Probably he did it in part to stave off student protest. He got out and led the student march from the campus in East Lansing to the state capitol and gave a rousing speech in the state. This is like 68 against the Vietnam War. Now, not too many college presidents today are going to do that. And this guy was only president for 1 year. He was on the way out. And then he retired then. All right, look, I just want to thank everybody for coming to this. Thank this panel. I think we ought to ask Kim for the last 4 paragraphs of that talk, because that is the lucid definition of CRT from the source's mouth. Or I think we ought to ask for that. I want to thank Michelle for all the labor on this, putting this together. My comrade in every crime we do. Tom, our education director. Melissa always leaves and never lets me embarrass her, who planned all your travel and everything else, and she's up there worrying about whether you're making your trains right now. So thank her if you see her. And Daniel, thanks for making all this stuff work. As always. And Cynthia, thank you for all the help here, moderating and handling. Okay. A last little quick tale, and then we will let you leave. Ralph Ellison wrote a short story essay. It's never quite clear which it ought to be called. 1965, in The Nation magazine. Right after, it's called Tell It Like It Is, Baby. He published it right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The simplest way, it goes like this, and I'll do it very briefly. It's much more complex than this, but here's the quick version. He talks about going to sleep one night in Rome. He's there at the American Academy. He's trying to write that second book. And he goes to sleep reading a book about classical tragedy. He names the book. And he has a terrible, terrible dream. And the story is the dream. He's a little boy in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's walking down the street. Sees a man out in front of him, thinks it's his father. He runs, it's Dad. No, shoot, it's not his father. He keeps walking. He goes through the train station, the trolley station. He walks by this huge equestrian monument, which is the Confederate monument. He doesn't call it that. And he keeps walking, he keeps walking, he keeps walking. And suddenly, and I think the way he put it was, like a picture book just fell out in front of me. And the whole dream collapses. And he's a little boy in like a Tau shirt, like a slave boy. He's in Washington, D.C. You're just told that. He's somehow in Washington, D.C. on the mall. And he looks, and there's like a procession of people, and he realizes it's some kind of weird funeral. They have a litter with a body on it. And this crowd is dancing and they're singing and they're drinking. And there's a body on the litter, and they're carrying the body. And then he's forced, somebody grabs him, there's a little boy in his towel shirt. He's forced into the crowd to help carry the litter. And he's terrified. Pretty soon you quickly realize you're at an alternative funeral of Abraham Lincoln. Because he starts describing the body on the litter. And the crowd gets drunker and crazier, and even names a few people who are, there's some incredible literary allusions in this story. I won't even name the names, except one of them is Edmund Wilson, whom every major writer hated by then. But the procession moves on, and it gets uglier and more horrible, and they start ripping Lincoln's ears off, and they start tearing his clothes off, and they start gouging at his eyes. And it ends at the Washington Monument. And they lay the litter down. And suddenly the narrator says, the body bloated up like the Michelin Man. I didn't know the Michelin Man had been created by 1965. So the body just bloated up. And it started squirting at people. It's a horror story. And then the nightmare ends, there's even more in there, but the nightmare ends with a giant hole in the ground, and the body's been taken down into the hole, and the whole crowd is down there, and they're cannibalizing the body. And then all of a sudden, black birds fly over, slimy black, that's right out of the book of Revelation. And then Ellison wakes up. And he talks about, he was sweating. He felt a sense of horror. He looks at the villa down below in Rome, and he thinks, maybe I'm okay. But the only way he could get to stop shaking, he says, and to get his wits back, was just to recite the Gettysburg Address over and over. He recites the Gettysburg Address over and over and over. Now, what is Ellison doing in that story? I don't know for sure. I don't know of any biography that ever figured it out. I don't know if anybody ever I'm sure people asked him, but Ellison being Ellison would have probably said, read the piece. But think of the moment that he published it. Right after the publication, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The most triumphal moment in the history of the Civil Rights Movement, arguably. It's Ellison saying history is never over, ever. And right when you think you've won, especially then, watch out.
Well, thank you, David.
With that happy note, hey, this story's not over. We have to keep fighting it. So thank you all for coming.